Hi, I'm CP, welcome to Bespoke Unit, and in this video I'm reviewing the Oliva Serie V Melanio. As per usual, this review was conducted using the Bespoke Unit Cigar Formula, a quantifiable review matrix that you can use at home. In the description you'll find a link which will take you to a guide on how to use it, as well as provide you with a blank PDF version that you can download. Otherwise, these cigars have been stored using the Boveda acrylic humidor that you see behind me. They were stored for 3 weeks using 69% Boveda packs and were monitored closely with a Boveda butler. This is a quality control step that we use to ensure that the cigars are properly acclimated and prepared for a review. The Oliva Serie V Melanio is probably one of the brand's most famous blends. It was released in 2012 and is named after the family's forefather, who grew tobacco in the 1880s in Cuba before serving in the Cuban War of Independence and then being taken over by his son Hipólito. Hipólito continued growing tobacco and eventually gave the business to his son Gilberto. Gilberto was a broker rather than a grower and travelled around different cigar producing countries to find a soil that resembled the Cuban soil that he knew and loved, eventually settling in Nicaragua, and today has created the brand that we all admire. The Oliva Serie V Melanio is assembled at the Tabacalera Oliva de Nicaragua, also known as Tabilosa. Tabilosa 1 is a new factory that was built in January 2020, and going forward I imagine that is where these cigars will be manufactured. The assembly style is hecho a mano, of course, made by hand, using the accordion method, and the wrapper is an Ecuadorian Sumatra. Interestingly, Oliva also own the brand Nub Cigars, and the Nub Sumatra uses the same wrapper leaf as the Melanio. However, as you can tell, there's a slight colour difference, so I imagine that this is a younger leaf compared to the one on the Melanio. It also features a Nicaraguan binder, and the filler, from what I have heard, consists of Jalapa Valley Habano, which is also from Nicaragua. Jumping into the look and feel, here I have an unsmoked one. So I've smoked about 3 of these for the review, and here's another one that I'm using as an example. As you can see, it's a box press. It is a 5x52 Robusto. Expect a sort of medium full experience, but we'll dive into greater detail on that later. The roll is relatively consistent. There are a couple of soft spots, given that it is a box press, so it tends to be looser when it's rolled. But the spring is nice and firm. In terms of its colour, it has a nice coffee bean hue and has an oily sheen. The veins are quite refined, and it doesn't have any strong rustic finishes. In terms of the aromas on the foot, I found them to be quite mild. They weren't overall intense. However, they did deliver a couple of notes that I found particularly interesting. The first one being ambergris. Ambergris is a natural musk. It's actually technically whale vomit and tends to have a sort of tobacco aroma to it, and a few other spicy hints of leather as well. It also has a little bit of cocoa in there, sweet cocoa rather than cacao, and a hint of cinnamon. As for the Prelight experience, when you cut the cigar you'll find that it has a very nice draw, nice and balanced. It is not too tight nor is it too open. The flavours are much richer than the aromas on the foot, and the aromas I had were tonka bean, so a nice hint of gourmand there, nutmeg spice, as well as a sweet fudge finish, which leaves a pleasant residue on the lips. Diving into the palate of this cigar and its flavour profile, what I found to be particularly interesting was that the first third is surprisingly delicate and distinctively medium in body. It delivers a very fragrant opening of rosewood, some curcuma spice, which is particularly prevalent on the retrohale, as well as a hint of black pepper that adds a bit of bold substance to it. Once you get into the second third, things change, and it's a very interesting transition that you'll particularly notice at the halfway mark. Here we had a little bit of pistachio saltiness, some nuttiness as well, and some thick, oozy, syrupy molasses. This was accompanied by a hint of nutmeg that appeared mostly in the retrohale, but was also there with the molasses, producing a rich, spicy and syrupy accord. As you make your way to the final third, things change once again, and it starts to become a little bit more settled. It's still quite verbose, it has a decent amount of body, but the flavours are certainly there. On this occasion, it starts to have a thicker, more savoury texture, and I experienced some espresso, some slightly bitter cacao nibs, as well as some resinous and slightly balsamic agarwood. As for the overall palate of the cigar, now it is much more complex than the original Serie V that I'm holding in my hand right here. In fact, I found it to be a very different experience overall. Although there were some similarities, especially with the hints of black pepper and some of the spiciness, it is an overall different cigar. The mouthfeel was particularly pleasant and was very creamy all the way through. It wasn't just velvety, it had a certain succulent texture to it. The astringence and the balance of the cigar is overall very harmonious. Although, that being said, it does focus at the center of the tongue rather than spreading to all the edges. At the beginning, it's slightly towards the front, but it creeps up and then settles right in the middle of the palate throughout the rest of the cigar. In terms of life cycle, this is a very interesting cigar with different moments throughout the whole experience. As I said, the most distinctive transition was at the halfway point and not necessarily earlier in the second third. In fact, the second third was quite late to transition into discovering new notes. The finish is quite long and lingering. It does last on your palate for a good half hour to 45 minutes, which means if you're accompanying this with a beverage, you can still savor some of the notes even after you've finished the cigar. As for the residual scent in the room, I found it to be particularly pleasant, especially when compared to the original Serie V or its Maduro counterpart. In fact, I found it to be quite fragrant and it didn't linger for too long. As for the burn and combustion of the cigar, you'll see that it performed very well if you check out the written review in the description below and see the final version of the cigar formula. Indeed, it got full marks because it gave me a nice, pleasant and balanced, consistent draw all the way through. Similarly, it provided a cool smoke and it didn't heat up whatsoever. The burn, as you can see, is straight. Even though I'm in the final third here, it didn't need touching up once whatsoever. And the ash backbone is very strong. In fact, it probably could have lasted throughout the majority of the 2/3 and I wouldn't have had to knock it off. However, I do like to knock it off just before doing my video because I don't want to embarrass myself by getting it all over my lap. As for the overall experience and presentation, what I find particularly interesting with Oliva is that the whole Serie V is quite consistent and uses the same overall band design. The only difference being is that on the sides you have Gran Reserva and Limitada, which on the original Serie V, you have Liga Especial, and the Serie V Maduro, you have Maduro Especial. The only difference here, aside from that, is that you have a secondary band on the Melanio, which repeats itself underneath with Gran Reserva Limitada. The bands are quite large, as you can see. It takes a fair bit of the cigar, so I had to remove the secondary one when I was smoking the cigar. In terms of the box is quite ornate. It comes in a 10 cigar box, which is made out of wood and lined with cedar. You can see pictures of that in the full written review, which is in the description below. In terms of value, this isn't much more expensive than the original Serie V. In fact, I was surprised by how little price difference there was. This is a double Robusto and will cost you $9 per single. The Melanio Robusto will cost you about $10.60, so you're looking at $1.60 for what I believe to be a much more complex and intriguing experience. I believe Paul also bought a couple of boxes of the Melanio and he got them on sale. I'm not sure what retail it was, but I believe that the single price per stick came to about $8 each. As for the occasion, this is a cigar that I would probably reserve for more special events. You could certainly take this to a wedding. Although it is quite complex, it is also very beginner friendly. It's also very versatile compared to the original Serie V that was somewhat bolder in body. This means that you can smoke the cigar at any other time of day. I'd say it'd be perfectly fine for an afternoon smoke, although it would probably be more suitable for the late evening. Indeed, it would be a great cigar as an aperitif or even a digestif around a meal, or you could enjoy it at a pleasant cigar lounge and kick back with a fine drink. This leads me on to the pairings, and this is the final consideration in our review. However, it is not scored. This is just something that we like to include to give you guys a couple of suggestions. First of all, in terms of food pairings, I would suggest cured ham or antipasti with this cigar. It would be very pleasant. As I mentioned earlier, it would be a great aperitif, and indeed you could pair it with a pleasant starter, especially if you're having a barbecue. Indeed, it would go very well with black forest ham or prosciutto. Alternatively, if you want something sweeter, go with a dark chocolate. I would suggest something perhaps more craft dark chocolate. For example, a creation by Argent Cove, which is based in Granada in Nicaragua. And finally, perhaps you could go with a pepperoni pizza, especially given that the pepperoni is going to have quite a spicy profile to it, which would go well with the cigar. As for beverages, I would first and foremost consider a Highland Single Malt Scotch. A well-aged single malt scotch like this would perhaps provide you with a level of complexity that you would like to pair with this cigar. Alternatively, rather than a cognac, which is what I suggested with the Oliva Serie V, I would potentially go here with an Armagnac. A Basse Armagnac tends to have more fruitiness, a greater level of character, and is a little bit more artisanal, and I believe that those would create a nice level of contrast and a pleasant flavour overall. And finally, if you like coffee, well, there you go. And finally, if you like coffee, why don't you go for an espresso? An espresso would be a great mineral, warm flavour that would be very, very pleasant with this cigar. As we've already reviewed the original Serie V and the Serie V Maduro, it's quite interesting to see how different this cigar really is. Indeed, it is somewhat milder, but also produces a much greater level of complexity. I believe that this is a cigar that is above and beyond the other two, and at first I didn't really see the difference until I compared them side by side. If you're looking for something that is a little bit more special than the original Serie V, I would certainly recommend that you try the Melanio. Indeed, it is complex and very beginner friendly at the same time, but just as rewarding for a veteran cigar enthusiast. That's all from me today. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Alternatively, head to bespokeunit.com and check around the channel and see all the other men's lifestyle subjects that we cover. Look forward to hearing from you. Take care.